When the doctor finally spoke the words, Victoria Hamilton didn't want to hear. The millionaire's daughter was just 7 days old. I apologize, but we are at a loss on what to do. The syndrome is too uncommon. Her liver has just quit functioning. Victoria felt Isabella's frail, tiny body struggle for each breath as she cradled her close to her bosom. 7 days. Her daughter had only experienced that life. The nation's top pediatric specialists were now abandoning her. Does a transplant have any chance of happening? With her voice breaking, she inquired, anticipating the response. We would need a compatible donor right away for a baby who is barely a week old. Even so, Dr. Peterson gave a solemn shake of his head. The likelihood is low. Antonio Silva, on the other side of the neonatal intensive care unit glass, silently observed the spectacle. He had only been employed for 6 months at the age of 32 as the Hamilton family's personal assistant and driver. But since Isabella's birth, he had been with them through every test, every doctor's visit, and every night of hopelessness. Antonio's habit of staying in the hospital longer than necessary went unnoticed by Victoria. How he specifically questioned the doctor when she wasn't present. How his eyes welled up with tears each time he saw that young girl struggling to survive. She was unaware that Antonio had been hiding anything for years. When he attempted to join the army at the age of 19 and completed all the required medical examinations, he learnt of this secret. His blood type was incredibly uncommon. Only one person out of every 500,000 possessed that particular combo. It's like to winning the lottery of genes. At the moment, the military doctor had made a joke. You have the ability to save lives that no one else could. Years later, Antonio never imagined those remarks would make so much sense. Her supervisor was crying uncontrollably as she watched a 7-day-old infant deteriorate. He had overheard the doctor mention how uncommon the required blood type was. He knew exactly what he needed to do after seeing the test results strewn all over the office table. That night, Antonio stayed in the corridor, staring through the glass. While Victoria finally dozed off, tired, in the chair beside the incubator. His scarlet lips fought the artificial respirator, and his Isabella appeared smaller every hour. A yellowed envelope containing his own blood tests from years ago, which he had kept in his wallet since the day she found out about her genetic oddity, was taken out of his pocket. He paused for a second. He worked as a black employee for an affluent white family, but he was only the driver. Who would think that his desire to assist was motivated by true love rather than selfishness? Antonio realized there was no turning back, however. When Isabella appeared to glance straight at him through the glass for a few seconds after opening her little eyes, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this tale of bravery and perseverance. What this guy was about to do would forever alter the concept of family, demonstrating that real love is unaffected by socioeconomic status, color, or prejudice. Antonio got at the hospital 2 hours earlier than normal the following morning. Before Victoria woke up, before the other doctors showed up, before he lost his courage, he had to speak with Dr. Peterson. The nurse behind the counter said, "I'm sorry, sir, but the neonatal intensive care unit does not allow unauthorized visitors." She didn't even look up from her computer when he came up. The Hamilton family is my employer. I have to discuss baby Isabella with the doctor. At last, a woman turned to face him, noticing her ebony skin and plain clothing. "That's the driver. You will have to wait for Mrs. Hamilton to come. You see, physicians don't talk about cases with staff members." Antonio's chest tightened in a familiar way. He had felt the same way 15 years prior, after graduating from public university medical school, but was unable to secure a residency at any private hospital due to his unsuitable profile for treating affluent patients. After 3 years of searching for a chance, he had given up on medicine. Prior to accepting the position with the Hamilton family, he worked as an ambulance driver and as a nurse in low-income clinics. However, he never lost his expertise and continued to study on his nights off. Calmly, he remarked, "I can wait," and sat down in the corridor. 2 hours later, Victoria showed up with sore eyes from crying. Isabella's night had been awful. Uncontrolled fever, convulsions, and deteriorating vital signs. Antonio got up and said, "Mrs. Hamilton, As she went by, Victoria paused in astonishment and asked, "Can I talk to you?" Antonio had never struck up a personal chat in their 6 months of collaboration. "What is it, Antonio?" "Oh, certainly." With shaky hands, he took the yellowed envelope out of his pocket. "I am able to assist Isabella." Victoria scowled in confusion. "How?" "The doctor stated it would be impossible to get the blood type she requires, but I have it." Her voice wavered for a second. "When I had these exams years ago, I want to get screened as a potential donor." The ensuing hush was deafening. Victoria gave him the impression that she was speaking a foreign language. "That's really nice of you, Antonio, but you don't get it. According to the doctor, she would require a family member who is compatible and has genetic ties. Respectfully, ma'am, they are mistaken." Antonio presented her the documents after opening the mail. Duffy antigen, negative, and blood type O negative. That combination is only found in 1 out of every 500,000 persons. He is among them. Antonio could see the reluctance in his eyes as Victoria took the papers. He is the object of mistrust, not the tests. In order to rescue the daughter of a white millionaire, a black driver wishes to give a portion of his liver. What could he possibly be interested in? "Antonio, thank you so much for your offer, but this is really complicated. Can I speak with him directly? The doctors would need to assess a lot of things, and there are legal concerns." Antonio interrupted gently just to show him the tests. Victoria nodded, but Antonio could tell that she had already decided that it wouldn't work. 30 minutes later, Dr. Peterson examined the papers with obvious irritation. "Sir Silva, Antonio Silva." "Mr. Silva, I understand his concern about the situation. But organ donation is an extremely complex process that goes far beyond blood compatibility. There are genetic factors, histocompatibility issues, hospital protocols. I understand perfectly, Dr. Antonio kept his voice calm. "That's why I suggested specific tests for HLA antigens, cross-matching," and Dr. Peterson interrupted him. Clearly surprised by his technical knowledge. "How do you know these terms?" Antonio hesitated. Revealing her medical training would be admitting that he had been undercover as a driver for years. I've done a lot of research on her case." "Look," the doctor sighed impatiently, "even if you are compatible, there are protocols. A living donor must undergo psychiatric, social, and financial evaluations. Hospitals do not accept donors who may have questionable motives." The implication was clear. A poor black man, a man wanting to donate an organ to a rich white child, could only have ulterior motives. "What kind of motives?" Antonio asked quietly. "Well, you've only been working for the family for a short time. Organ donation is a significant gesture. Some may question whether there are expectations of financial compensation or other benefits." Antonio felt anger rising in his throat, but he took a deep breath. "Doctor, if you'll allow him, he'd just like to have the specific tests done. If he's not a match, forget he ever suggested this." Dr. Peterson looked at Victoria, who nodded hesitantly. "All right, but don't get your hopes up. The chances are slim, and even if you are compatible, there are many other issues involved." 3 days later, Antonio received a call. Dr. Peterson's voice sounded different, tense, almost incredulous. "Mr. Silva, you need to come back to the hospital today." Antonio knew exactly what that tone meant. The tests had confirmed what he already knew. He was a perfect match, so perfect that it would be statistically impossible to find another donor like him. But when he arrived at the hospital, he found Victoria crying in the hallway and a group of doctors in heated discussion. "Mrs. Hamilton," he approached. "What happened?" Victoria lifted her tear-stained face. "The tests, you are indeed compatible. Perfectly compatible." She paused as if she couldn't believe her own words. "But they won't authorize the surgery." Antonio felt his heart race. "Why?" It was Dr. Peterson who answered, avoiding his gaze. "The hospital ethics committee has decided that there are too many risk factors involved. Liability issues, safety protocols." Translation, Antonio said slowly. "You don't trust him?" The silence was the answer he needed. That night, alone in his small apartment, Antonio looked out the window and thought of the 7-day-old baby fighting for her life a few miles away. He thought of Victoria, who treated him well, but never really saw him as someone capable of saving her daughter. He thought of the doctors who questioned his motives simply because he was black and poor. He opened his old laptop and began to search. Antonio responded. Isabella couldn't wait for bureaucratic procedures and moved the infant to a hospital stretcher. Meet Victoria Hamilton, James. The greatest pediatric surgeon I've ever met is Dr. James Mitchell. Mrs. Hamilton. Victoria's life was at its most stressful over the following 6 hours. Even though Antonio was doing her first operation in 15 years as an assistant surgeon, her hands moved with the dexterity of someone who had never stopped mentally rehearsing every technique. Dr. Mitchell whispered, "My God." When the procedure was being performed, her suturing technique is impeccable. Where did she graduate from again? Federal University, class of 2008. And why did she stop practicing? Antonio paused before answering, focused on delicately connecting the blood vessels. Because no hospital wanted to give her a chance. They said I didn't have the right profile to work with certain families. Dr. Mitchell stopped operating for a moment. Antonio, you're saving this child's life with a technique that rivals Harvard surgeons. Any hospital that rejected you lost one of the best professionals they could have had. Meanwhile, 400 meters away, Dr. Peterson received a call that made him pale. What do you mean? They took the patient to another state. Who authorized that? Sir, said the nervous nurse. The family's driver. Apparently, he's a doctor. He transferred the baby to a specialized hospital in the middle of the night. Dr. Peterson felt his blood run cold. A doctor, disguised as a driver, had been observing all the procedures for months, questioning decisions, taking notes, and they had rejected the only compatible donor simply because they didn't trust her motives. Call the legal department, he shouted. Now, but it was too late. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dr. James Mitchell emerged from the operating room with a weary smile. The surgery was a complete success. Isabella's body has completely adapted Antonio's liver to it. She is alert, stable, and reacting appropriately. Victoria broke out in tears of relief as she slumped in the corridor. Antonio came softly, still in his surgical clothes. Victoria said, "Can I see her?" Isabella was awake for the first time in weeks in the pediatric intensive care unit. Her breathing was steady, her lips were pink, and she gave a possible smile when she saw Victoria. Antonio remarked quietly, keeping a close eye on the monitors, "She's going to live." Squelly, "No." Victoria gave him a look. For the first time in 6 months, I gave him a serious look. I spent all this time treating him like a driver because that's what I was to my daughter. And it's okay. You saved her. No, it's not acceptable. Victoria grasped his hand. I let my biases to blind me to the fact that you are the most skilled physician I have ever encountered. Because they don't look like me, how many other exceptional professionals do I hate every day? Victoria's phone rang at that very moment. The number was unidentified. Hamilton, Mrs. It was a tense voice. Official Isabella was admitted to this hospital, and this is Dr. Peterson. We must discuss the patient's inconsistent transfer immediately. There are important legal considerations. Victoria glanced at Antonio, who was coolly taking her daughter's vital signs, the kid who was still alive because of him. She spoke with a coldness she had never used before. Dr. Peterson, instead of accepting the lone suitable donor, he decided to follow procedures when he had months to preserve my daughter. She's alive now because of a doctor you didn't trust. However, ma'am, there are rules and obligations under the law. Be prepared to explain to a court why you rejected a perfectly qualified donor, because, as we speak, she's calling the best law firm she knows. Dr. Victoria interrupted, looking at Antonio before hanging up. Antonio grinned for the first time in months as he said, "I hope you're ready to never hide again because the world is going to know who really saved Isabella." It was Dr. Antonio Silva's confident smile, not the driver's courteous one. Hamilton, Ms., I didn't hide out of fear of failing. I chose to hide because I knew that once my actual abilities were exposed, it would be hard to ignore the number of others who are being wasted by a system that evaluates people based more on appearance than on their character. The narrative was leaked to the media within the next 48 hours. Rejected by elite hospital, a black doctor masquerading as a motorist saves the infant. Antonio would learn that saving Isabella was merely the start of a revolution that would alter not only her lives, but also a whole system that would eventually be forced to face its own biases as the headlines spread like wildfire. They were all unaware that the actual fight was only getting started, because the system does not readily relinquish its haughtiness when a man disproves it. 6 months later, Isabella's pink cheeks and contagious laughter filled the Hamilton mansion's garden as she ran through what had previously been a quiet haven of hopelessness. Antonio, in his white coat now, stood on a terrace and observed her. Antonio Silva, the recently appointed head of St. Mary's Hospital's pediatric transplant department. In public shame, Dr. Peterson had been dismissed. 3 families were suing the hospital for medical malpractice based on racial discrimination, and the hospital was the subject of a federal investigation into discriminatory practices. It destroyed his career. His name will always be connected to the story of the doctor who saved a life while specialists refused to assist due to racism. Victoria came over with a coffee cup. This arrived today. Antonia. She gave him a formal letter inviting him to give a talk on breaking down medical systemic hurdles at Harvard Medical School. Antonio neatly folded the letter while grinning. They rejected him 15 years ago on the grounds that his profile wasn't appropriate. He will, of course, agree to their request today to instruct other medical professionals. When they ought to be saving lives, how many other Antonio Silvas are operating motor vehicles? Isabella rushed towards them and embraced Antonio's legs. Let's play, Daddy Tony. Formal adoption had been Victoria's insistence. Antonio was no longer the disguised doctor or the driver. He was a parent chosen out of love, which outweighed all prejudice rather than blood. Antonio thought back on the trip as he put Isabella to bed that evening. He had spent 15 years concealing who he really was. However, he had won an incalculable asset, a daughter, as well as the opportunity to change a system that had nearly allowed a kid to die due to blatant discrimination. Destroying the doctors who had turned him down was not the finest form of retaliation. It was demonstrating that skill, love, and commitment are universal, and that the greatest successes can occasionally come from the people society least expects. If this tale of love triumphing over adversity resonated with him, please subscribe to the channel for more tales that demonstrate that true greatness is unbounded by prejudice and that true love always overcomes ignorance. There were other options, other hospitals perhaps in other states where the rules were different, where a man like him could save a child without her skin color being seen as a risk factor, because Isabella was dying and he had in his body exactly what she needed to live. And if the system wouldn't let him do it the right way, maybe it was time to find out how many rules a man desperate to save a life was willing to break. What those doctors didn't know was that Antonio Silva wasn't just a well-meaning driver. He was a trained doctor who had spent 15 years studying exactly this type of surgery, waiting for a chance to prove that competence has no skin color. Antonio didn't sleep that night. Sitting at the kitchen table in his small apartment, surrounded by stacks of printed medical articles and pediatric surgery books, he reverted to who he really was, Dr. Antonio Silva, who had graduated from a federal university with a medical degree 15 years ago. He had lied to the Hamilton family from day one, not because he wanted to deceive them, but because he knew that a black doctor who had been unemployed for years due to prejudice would not even get an interview for a driver's job with a wealthy white family. It was easier to be just a competent driver than to explain why a medical graduate was driving cars. But now, looking at Isabella's medical records, which he had discreetly photographed during consultations, Antonio saw exactly what the doctors were missing. Isabella's syndrome was rare, yes, but there were documented cases of successful transplants. The problem wasn't medical, it was political. At 3 o'clock in the morning, his phone rang. It was Dr. James Mitchell, his college classmate, who now ran the pediatric transplant program at St. Mary's Children's Hospital in another state. Antonio, man, it's been years since we last spoke. I saw her message about the neonatal liver transplant case. Antonio explained everything. Isabella, the perfect compatibility tests, the hospital's refusal on ethical grounds. My God, James sighed on the other end of the line. Are you telling me he rejected a perfectly compatible donor because he thinks you have ulterior motives? That's medical insanity. James, I need help. This child will die if we don't do something. Wait a minute. You said you work as a driver. What happened to her medical career? Antonio hesitated before telling the truth. How he had been rejected from every residency program 15 years ago despite his excellent grades. How he had tried private clinics and been dismissed for not having the right profile for our patients. How he had given up on medicine and taken any job that paid the bills. Man, that's unacceptable. You are one of the best in our class. James was silent for a moment. Antonio, what if I told his that I can authorize this transplant here? Our protocols are different. As long as he passes the medical and psychological evaluations, we can do the surgery. Antonio felt his heart race. Would you do that? Of course, I would. But there's a problem. You'd need to bring the baby here without the consent of her current doctors. Technically, it would be transferring a critically ill patient without formal medical authorization. What about the legal risks? For his sake, enormous; for me, manageable. If we justify it as a medical emergency, but Antonio, if something goes wrong during transport or surgery, he could be held criminally liable. Antonio looked at the photo of Isabella he had placed on the refrigerator. The baby sleeping in Victoria's arms, still unaware that she was dying. James, I accept all the risks. The next day, Antonio arrived at the Hamilton mansion with a plan. He needed to convince Victoria to seek a second medical opinion without revealing the whole truth about her qualifications. Mrs. Can I talk to her? Hamilton. Victoria was in the living room, looking out the window. She had cried so much in recent weeks that her eyes looked permanently red. Of course, Antonio, a pediatric transplant specialist, is someone I know. St. Mary's Hospital's Dr. James Mitchell. He wants to assess Isabella's situation. Victoria looked startled. How do you identify a transplant expert? Antonio had this response ready. At that hospital, my sister is a nurse. Dr. Mitchell expressed interest in the situation when she brought it up to him. Although it was a falsehood, it was a potentially life-saving deception. The doctors here have been extremely clear. Antonio, hope is gone. Respectfully, ma'am, there are instances when it's worthwhile to hear another viewpoint. In such situations, Dr. Mitchell has saved children. Victoria paused. She had seen a change in Antonio over the last several days. He posed technical queries to the doctor that a normal motorist would not pose. He spoke fluently in medical jargon, and his eyes had a resolve that transcended an employee's mere worry. You know what medicine is, Antonia? Antonio inhaled deeply. Part of the truth had to come out. Indeed, ma'am. I'm a medical graduate. Due to personal circumstances, I haven't practiced in a few years, but I haven't stopped studying. Victoria gazed at him in disbelief. Are you a medical professional? Why didn't you inform me earlier, since I was aware that you wouldn't employ me? Families like her are not encouraged by a black doctor without a job. Victoria felt as though she had been slapped across the face by the answer's terrible honesty. She recognized his correctness. A doctor would never have been recruited by her as a driver. She would have questioned his skills or motivations right away. I'm at a loss for words, Antonio. You don't need to speak, ma'am. Allow me to attempt to save Isabella, please. Victoria's phone rang at that very moment. Dr. Peterson was the one. I regret to notify you, Mr. Hamilton, but Isabella's health has taken a serious turn for the worse in the past few hours. We advise you to be ready for anything. Victoria sobbed as she fell onto the couch. Antonio was kneeling next to her. One day, Mrs. Hamilton, allow me to bring her to see Dr. Mitchell. In the event that it fails, at least we tried everything. Through her tears, Victoria gazed at him. Why don't you drive vehicles instead of saving lives if you're a true doctor? Antonio said quietly, because the system does not allow men like him to save lives. However, that does not imply that he will stop trying. Victoria was aware that this was the riskiest choice she would ever make, but for the first time in 6 months, she truly looked at Antonio and noticed something she had totally overlooked. "I hope, okay. However, Antonio, I accept complete responsibility for anything that happens to her while on this trip." Additionally, Dr. Antonio Silva is his true identity, Mrs. Hamilton. He wants Isabella to know him in this way as she grows up. Victoria smiled for the first time since Isabella was born. It wasn't joy. Finding someone who was willing to fight while everyone else had given up was a relief. Victoria observed through the glass as Antonio made the subtle arrangements for the medical relocation. She had lived with a doctor who was posing as a driver for 6 months. He was sympathetic to her daughter's situation, but had to conceal his true identity due to her own biases, and now, in order to save a child who wasn't even her daughter, that same guy was putting everything on the line: his career, his freedom, and his life. Isabella wasn't just fortunate to have found a matching donor, Victoria realized. Finding someone who loved her enough to reject a whole system that stated he wasn't deserving of saving her was fortunate for her. Victoria was unaware that in less than 12 hours, Antonio would load Isabella into his car and drive 8 hours to another state with portable medical equipment he had borrowed from a hospital. Victoria would bet her life and freedom on the idea that love would triumph over all the prejudices that nearly caused a child to die because her savior had a different skin tone. Around the portable medical equipment he had surreptitiously borrowed from a hospital during his months of employment. Antonio put Isabella in the back seat of his automobile at 5 in the morning. He charged the batteries for the oxygen tank, infusion pump, and heart monitor over the night. Victoria watched as Antonio expertly connected the final cables while sitting next to her daughter and caressing her small hand. "Don't you have a good sense of what you're doing?" "Indeed, ma'am. Believe me." Time was of the essence throughout the 8-hour journey. Antonio paused every 2 hours to change Isabella's IV bags, check her vital signs, and adjust her medication. He changed completely, and Victoria watched with curiosity. The timid driver was gone, replaced by a self-assured, capable physician who understood exactly how to maintain the stability of a 7-day-old infant in the event of an emergency. During one of the stops, she asked, "Why did you really hide all these months, Antonio?" Before responding, he made adjustments to the monitor. "Mrs. Hamilton, a black doctor without a job, would be regarded with suspicion because I am aware of how the world functions. A skilled driver would simply be more productive. Being undervalued was simpler than being questioned when it came to caring for Isabella." Dr. James Mitchell waited at St. Mary's Hospital, the whole surgical team ready. He grinned when he watched Antonio exit the vehicle with Isabella, her medical equipment in perfect operating order. "Antonio, you've transformed his car into a mobile intensive care unit.